Canadians are remembering the life of Brian Mulroney, Canada's 18th Prime Minister, and part of Mulroney's imprint on Canada's history is his complex relationship with Indigenous communities. One of the defining moments of Mulroney's tenure was the Oka crisis in 1990. The 78-day standoff had a profound effect on the relationship between the Crown and First Nations and prompted Mulroney to create the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1991. Someone who was witness to this part of Mulroney's legacy, Governor-General Mary Simon. She served as policy co-director of the commission, and later, Simon was part of Mulroney's attempts to amend the Constitution through the Charlottetown Accord. This is the process that codified the Indigenous right to self-government. Here's part of Mulroney and Mary Simon making that announcement in August 1992.
And so this is an important achievement for the Aboriginal peoples, and a very significant day, I think, for justice for the Aboriginal peoples in Canada, while respecting the orderly nature of the process.
There will be more impetus on the part of governments to negotiate self-government agreements with Inuit and other Aboriginal peoples, and this is a critical step forward.
Eventually, Mary Simon served as commissioner of the Nunavut Implementation Commission, and in one of his final acts as Prime Minister, Mulroney was one of the signatories of the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement in 1993. Governor-General Mary Simon, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
I wonder if I could just start with, what was your reaction when you heard that Brian Mulroney had died?
It was shocking. We had heard that he was not well, but it didn't sound like it was as serious as it really was. So when we heard about it, we were kind of glued to the TV to see what else was going to be said about him passing. So that night we watched the whole series of people talking about Brian Mulroney, and it made me reflect back on some of the things that I knew about him, and because I had worked with him a number of times as well.
I want to talk about that because in the initial aftermath of the news, there was a lot of focus on free trade, apartheid, acid rain, not so much of a focus on Indigenous issues and his legacy on that. And a lot of Indigenous leaders and scholars and researchers, they see Mulroney's legacy on this as complex, maybe even polarizing. How do you see it?
Well, first of all, I think the times I did spend with him, I always felt he was very forward-looking, and he was also, I thought, a visionary, because he tackled some pretty difficult issues as Prime Minister. I can remember when we were having the constitutional negotiations back in the 80s, and then the Charlottetown Accord after that. You know, there were some very challenging moments, but we all tried to work through it, and I think that when we ended up with the Charlottetown Accord, there was in fact a chapter in the Charlottetown Accord that addressed the self-government of Aboriginal peoples. So those were things that weren't easy to accomplish. And then again, when the territory of Nunavut was being contemplated and the land claims negotiations was negotiated, Mr. Mulroney was quite active in those events, and he signed the land claims agreement, and also they passed legislation that committed the federal government in the creation of the new territory of Nunavut, and that would be the change that Canada had made for the first time since Newfoundland joined the federation of the country. So these were, like, I think, monumental moments in his time.
There were challenges with Meech, though, about Indigenous inclusion and Indigenous involvement. You were involved in Charlottetown in the negotiations on that. What's your reflection on those two moments, and how did you see Brian Mulroney's maybe views on these topics change over time?
Meech Lake was a difficult time for Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples, as we were called then. There was not a lot of time given to Indigenous leaders to participate in Meech Lake. And if you remember Elijah Harper, voted with his feather, and Meech Lake, as a result, didn't go through. But there was a different, I think, attitude during the Charlottetown Accord negotiations, whereby I think all governments worked together to, in fact, try and move forward on the rights of Indigenous people, Aboriginal peoples in Canada. You know, I mean, I think all of us at some point have to face the reality of what we're doing, and I think he was polarizing at times, but that wasn't the main thing that I remember. I remember Brian Mulroney as being someone that was very engaging, talking to people, just coming up to people and talking to us and finding out what the issues were, what we were having difficulty with, and trying to manage those types of conversations. So it was both, you know, challenging and sometimes very open discussions. And for me, the constitutional negotiations were a big, challenging moment in Canada's history.
What was it like in those, in Charlottetown, as an Inuk woman in a process where pretty much everyone else was a white guy? What was it like for you there?
Well, being a woman started sometime before that, and there was moments in those negotiations where being the only woman wasn't always in my best interest. And I did speak out, though. I spoke out like when I felt it was necessary to speak out on behalf of our people, the Inuit, and there were times when you know, we also agreed with what was going on. But it's always been a challenge being a woman leader. I think in this day and age it's a different type of a challenge, more so on lines, negative issues that are directed towards women in general, young women and girls. So it's almost like a different challenge, but similar. Whereas when I was a woman, the only woman, I was able to challenge that person directly. Right. And that was something, either you resolved it or you didn't, you know, but it seemed to be that you could deal with it more directly.
Issues like Meech and Charlottetown, as controversial as they were, these were things that Brian Mulroney set out to do. They were intentional. On the Indigenous issue, the thing he did not set out to do was the Oka crisis, which happened during his time as Prime Minister, the Mohawk and the military standing off over the expansion of a golf course in Quebec. This was happening as the final stages of the Nunavut negotiations were happening. How do you view how he handled that? Did it impact in any way what was happening in the Nunavut talks?
I think it was two different issues. I think with the Mohawk situation, it was about a piece of land. And there was a lot of, I guess, conflict in relation to how to solve that. And I was a very young person living in Montreal at the time, and a lot of my Indigenous friends were being treated by the public in a very negative way. So that was not a good situation for Canada as a whole. In terms of the territory, the creation of the territory, those were long fought out negotiations as well. Sometimes they stalled for long periods of time and then they would come back and continue. So it was like many years before that agreement was finally agreed upon. And I know that the Nunavut leaders fought very hard to create a new territory for Inuit. So that's when they decided to divide the Northwest Territories into two territories. Mm-hmm. And Prime Minister Mulroney was there to sign the land claims agreement and also legislation that would commit to creating the territory some years later.
Now, in the wake of Oka, though, it led to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. A lot of its findings, people will say, stand the test of time. They hold true today. But I don't know if it had sort of the momentum for change in the present day, in the day of the time that people were hoping for. But what is your sense of the significance of that event, and whether it was a success or a failure, or how it affects today?
The work of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was very intensive, and it took a number of years to reach the point where they could release the report, because it included First Nations, Inuit and Métis, and people that aren't living on reserve, so it was very encompassing. And a lot of the issues that are in that report have transcended into other parts of what we're doing now. So when it was released, it didn't pick up the kind of momentum that was expected.
Right.
And didn't, the implementation side of it was very much stalled. But when the TRC was created, when other agreements were being considered, a lot of those elements that are in the Royal Commission have been also recognized in other agreements and in the reports like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Right, so it became foundational in some
ways. Yeah, very
foundational.
Yeah, it became very foundational.
So one of the things, just as a final point, Your Excellency, a lot of people in remembering Brian Mulroney talk about a very personal moment or personal connection they had with him, because he was quite good at that. That was one of his successes in politics. Is there a specific memory you have about the former Prime Minister that you'd like to share?
It's not so much personal between him and I, but personal in terms of what I've been doing with the rest of my career. Mr. Mulroney was in Russia, and in Leningrad, in fact, and he gave a speech there, and at some point in his speech he says, why not an Arctic Council? So the government was also deciding at that point to create an ambassador for circumpolar affairs. So when one of the ministers that was speaking at a conference said those words, I came up to him and I said, how do I apply? So I've been doing that kind of work. So that's a moment in terms of how I remember the Prime Minister Mulroney, as being a significant individual that now we created an eight-country Arctic Council, and the role of permanent participants, the Indigenous leaders in the north, or the Indigenous peoples in the north, in the Arctic region, have permanent status in that council. So that, you know, like there's a flow of events that happened from certain things that Mr. Mulroney said or started, to the point now where we have a lot of pro action going on. I mean, it's a forever job to get this thing right, but you know, you have to keep going and moving forward, and try not to reinvent the wheel all the time.
Governor General Mary Simon, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.